I see a wanted sketch of the Zodiac killer, and it looked just like the only photo I had of my father, which was his mugshot.
He thought he was just searching for his father. What he found could rewrite one of the darkest chapters in American crime history. A man from Louisiana claims he's uncovered the Zodiac Slayer's true identity, and it's someone far closer than anyone dared imagine. But this isn't just another wild theory. It's personal. Twisted headlines, cryptic messages, a shocking photo, and a name buried in scandal all point to a terrifying possibility. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, it does. One moment sparked the journey. One face changed everything. You've heard Zodiac theories before, but not like this. Buckle up. This isn't about who the Zodiac was. It's about what he left behind. A chilling recognition on TV. One quiet evening in Louisiana, Gary L. Stewart sat in his living room watching a true crime documentary when an image flashed on the screen that would alter the course of his life forever. It was a composite police sketch from 1969, one of the most iconic depictions of the Zodiac Slayer ever circulated. The face, drawn decades ago from eyewitness accounts, showed a round head, thick-rimmed glasses, and an emotionless stare. For many viewers, it was just a haunting relic of unsolved history. But for Stewart, it was deeply personal. The sketch triggered something primal. He later claimed he gasped audibly and felt his entire body seize with fear and recognition. According to Stewart's own account, his son happened to be in the room during that moment. As the sketch lingered on the screen, his son turned to him and casually remarked, "That looks like Grandpa." It was an eerie comment that added another jolt to the already surreal moment. To Stewart, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was confirmation. The grandpa his son was referring to wasn't a man who had been part of their family life. In fact, Stewart had only recently come into possession of a single image of his biological father, whom he had never met in person. The resemblance, he insisted, was too strong to dismiss. In a rush, with adrenaline coursing through him, Stewart went to his home office and got the one picture he had of his biological father, a black-and-white picture that he thought was an old DMV portrait. With all other areas of Stewart's life largely wiped out, Earl Van Best Jr. became a more substantial and significant figure when Stewart was starting to piece together information about his birth mother, Judith Chandler. But now that Stewart was peering at the photograph through different lenses, he was convinced that this was no boring mugshot ID photo. It was a shot taken from a police file. In fact, he thought the guy depicted looked just about identical to the Zodiac sketch. The notion that this criminal from his family history could well be the one who terrorized Northern California in the late 60s sent Stewart down a spiral. Now, Stewart said he was obsessed with finding the truth. The rumors of Van Best's violent past and devilish ways fueled his resolve. Beginning an investigation that extended over the course of years, he tracked old records, court documents, and forensic theories. Who had any idea, Stewart said, that he may have inadvertently come across the identity of one of America's most infamous serial slayers, not in a police file, but in a family photo album? What Stewart didn't know then was that the face on the screen was only the beginning. The truth about his origins would prove far more unsettling than the sketch ever hinted. A mother's truth. For most of his life, Gary Stewart knew only fragments about his origins. Adopted as an infant, he had been raised in Baton Rouge by loving parents, but the questions about where he came from never fully left him. In 2002, when Stewart was 39 years old, those questions were finally answered in a phone call that would upend everything he thought he knew. His birth mother, Judith Chandler, had spent years searching for him, and after decades of silence, She was ready to reveal the story she had carried in secret. Their reunion was emotional and deeply personal. Two strangers connected by blood and shadowed by a troubled past. During their early conversations, Judith revealed a piece of her past that Stewart could never have anticipated. In the early 1960s, when she was just 13 years old, Judith had entered into what newspapers would later dub the ice cream romance with a 27-year-old man named Earl Van Best Jr. Their relationship, scandalous even by the looser standards of the time, quickly escalated into a secret marriage after Chandler became pregnant. Her age made the marriage illegal, and it was soon annulled, but the damage had already been done. Judith would later describe the relationship not as youthful rebellion, but as one marked by control, fear, and violation. This was when Stewart learned many consider intimation of statutory indecent assault guilty as charged. He was born on February 12, 1963, soon after Judith's journey to New Orleans with Van Best. Stewart was to remember nothing of the first month of his life, except that he had been abandoned by his father in a stairwell for purposes of adoption. Judith had surrendered him under dire circumstances whereby even she and Van Best were arrested, and their lawless, frantic romance came to an end. According to him, all these things put Stewart into a kind of disarray, whereby he was irate and frustrated, trying to establish any reason as to why the one man in his existence had happened to father him and subsequently reject him. Their search for identity degenerated from a personal attempt into an obsession. Learning the name of his biological father was like lighting a fuse. Stewart not only wanted to know who Earl Van Best Jr. was, he wanted to know why. The discovery reoriented his life, changing him from an adopted child with questions to a man with purpose. Stories about Van Best's troubled life, criminal history, and odd ways only added material to Stewart's growing conviction that all was not right with the world, perhaps something much darker than anyone could ever suspect. The ice cream romance scandal. In 1961, a controversial and widely publicized story began when Earl Van Best Jr., then 27, met 13-year-old Judith Chandler outside an ice cream shop in San Francisco. What followed would become known as the ice cream romance, a nickname coined by the press to describe the unusual and troubling relationship. According to later accounts, Van Best began spending increasing amounts of time around Judith, earning her trust and affection despite their significant age gap. Those who knew of the situation at the time reportedly expressed concern, but the full extent of their relationship didn't become public until much later. The dynamic between them, described by some as inappropriate and controlling, set off a chain of events that would dominate headlines in the Bay Area. Eventually, Van Best convinced Judith to run away with him, and the two traveled to Reno, Nevada, where they were married in secret. Because Judith was legally underage, the marriage was not recognized and was later annulled by the courts. Her family, alarmed by her sudden disappearance, contacted the authorities. Van Best was arrested shortly afterward and charged with several offenses related to his actions, sparking a major legal and public backlash. The story gained traction quickly, not only because of the age difference, but also because of the legal implications and the high-profile nature of the case. The charges, combined with Judith's age, framed the story in a serious and disturbing light, though Van Best continued to insist that the relationship was based on mutual affection. However, quite the opposite was what the case turned out to be for the media. Almost the next thing a journalist would bathe on while squeezing all the boys' hormones into a word was ice cream romance. The local newspapers published headlines, each trumpeting some new, wonderful, strange aspect of the affair. Collections of articles appeared with less legal commentary on consequences, and much more the notion of a couple caught in forbidden love, they being the star-crossed protagonists in a tragic tale. All this went to create buzz and great divergence among opinions. Some would find it reckless, even damaging for the story, while others thrived on romanticism. It is against this diverse backdrop of human opinion that the moniker now endures as a legacy of the case. Van Best fled again after being released on bail on this occasion with Judith, going cross-country with her. They are rumored to have traveled under different names, constantly on the move to avoid being apprehended, it was said, just ahead of the wheels of law enforcement. Eventually, they settled in New Orleans, where Judith gave birth to their son, Gary Stewart, in 1963. The couple's life was brief and chaotic. Soon after the birth, Van Best was reported to have left the baby in Louisiana, where the infant was adopted. This tumultuous and scandal-ridden period would become a defining piece of Gary Stewart's later investigation into his origins, and the man he came to believe had hidden a far darker past than almost anyone appreciated anywhere. A baby left behind. Following a chaotic period of running from the law, Earl Van Best Jr. and Judith Chandler eventually arrived in New Orleans, where their son, Gary Stewart, was born on February 12, 1963. But the fragile family unit quickly unraveled. According to Stewart's later recollections, just 1 month after his birth, Van Best made a shocking decision that would haunt both him and his son for decades to come. He reportedly abandoned the infant in the stairwell of an apartment building in Baton Rouge. The story, passed down through family accounts and rumored details, paints a disturbing picture: a newborn left behind without warning, with no note, no protection, and no plan for care. The decision marked a sudden and callous severance between father and son, ending any hope of a traditional family life. The impact of this abandonment on Gary Stewart's later life was profound. Though too young to remember the event, the psychological weight of being discarded in such a manner would shape his identity for years to come. Stewart has described growing up with an aching sense of incompleteness, a void where his origin story should have been. As he got older and learned more about the circumstances of his birth, he struggled to understand how someone could leave their child so abruptly. The act was not only physically dangerous, but also emotionally scarring, sending a silent message of rejection that Stewart carried long before he ever knew the full truth. These early experiences planted the seeds of the lifelong questions that would eventually fuel his search for answers. Not long after they deserted their car, the authorities arrested Van Best and Chandler. The cross-country odyssey had come to an end, and the illegal actions, already making headlines, came to a dramatic climax. Judith now found herself facing motherhood as a teenage girl without her parents' support, entangled in legal problems and with no means to raise her child. Thus, she was left with no option other than to put Gary up for adoption. The circumstances were far from perfect, but they finally brought Gary to the loving stewardship of Lloyd and Leona Stewart, residing in Baton Rouge, the only loving home he was denied from the very start. In the Stewarts, Gary discovered what had been lacking in his life from the first minutes of his birth. Good in itself after such previous chaos were the solid, loving parent figures that Lloyd and Leona presented. However aware Gary was that he was adopted, it was a family context into which he apparently fitted well. Yet, as he matured, he seemed to find that mystery relative to his biological parents never quite went away. The effects of abandonment, alongside the awareness of a past he did not choose at last, forced him to discover the truth. What he found, however, would shock not only him, but also many others convinced the Zodiac Slayer case was long solved. The descent into obsession. The moment Gary Stewart saw the Zodiac Slayer sketch on television and believed it resembled his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., everything changed. What started as a chilling coincidence quickly grew into an all-consuming mission. Stewart began to chronicle every known detail about Van Best's life, from his troubled youth to his criminal history and obscure movements during the late 1960s. He pored over birth records, marriage licenses, arrest reports, and any scrap of information he could find. What might have been a passing curiosity for others became, for Stewart, a personal obsession, one rooted in pain, identity, and the need to confront the ghost of a man he never really knew. Stewart put an immense number of investigative tools to use in furtherance of his case. He investigated genealogy databases to trace back Van Best's family history and scoured thousands of old newspaper clippings looking for articles that mentioned his father's name. He contacted local librarians, archivists, and police to obtain public records. Stewart examined court documents relating to Van Best's previous arrests, as well as transcripts, letters, and personal notes that survived from the early 1960s. Reports also suggest he contacted people who had known his father, seeking to fill in the gaps and find patterns that matched with the timeline of the Zodiac Slayer. The investigation became a second job, a mission born of a personal need that went far beyond the mere interest, an odyssey for identity drenched in suspicion and sorrow. Stewart kept on accumulating data and started organizing them into an elaborate journal. This was no informal diary entry, but a careful assembly of timelines, maps, photographs, and behavior analyses. He matched handwriting samples, tracked the movements of Van Best during the Zodiac slayings, and noted possible links to known victims or crime scenes. Over the decades, his journal had grown into a large body and repository of opinion and evidence, some more compelling than others. There were rumors attached to Stewart's research, including assertions that he found hidden clues in Zodiac ciphers that pointed towards his father's name. Whether or not such ties were valid, they only served to reinforce his belief that he truly was onto something big. Stewart's journaling ultimately became the building blocks of what became his book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, which he co-wrote with investigative journalist Susan Mustafa. The two went ahead to transform the years of that private research into a public narrative explaining one of America's most elusive serial slayers. The book drew national interest and sparked heated debate, culminating in an FX documentary series. While some have considered Stewart's claims controversial, even sensational, they nevertheless served to energize public interest in the Zodiac case. To Stewart, it was far more than a mere book. It was a culmination of years of obsession and ultimately a desperate attempt at reconciling with the truth of where he had come from. Just when the paper trail seemed overwhelming, a single photograph would send his investigation into an entirely new and eerily visual direction. The photographic and physical parallels. One of the most visually compelling aspects of Gary Stewart's theory lies in the side-by-side comparison of two images: a 1962 mugshot of Earl Van Best Jr. and the widely circulated composite sketch of the Zodiac Slayer created from eyewitness descriptions in 1969. For Stewart, the resemblance between the two was not only striking, but alarming. The shape of the face, the hairstyle, the heavy-rimmed glasses, and even the expression, he claimed they were nearly identical. This moment of visual recognition was, for Stewart, a key piece of the puzzle, one that convinced him early in his investigation that he wasn't just imagining a resemblance, but had possibly stumbled upon the truth behind one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. In an effort to add credibility to the visual similarities he saw, Stewart enlisted the help of forensic artists and facial recognition consultants. These professionals were asked to analyze the features of Van Best and compare them with the composite sketch of the Zodiac. Some of these experts reportedly concluded that there were notable resemblances between the two images. Key points of alignment included the forehead slope, eye positioning, and chin structure. Stewart cited these evaluations as strong support for his belief that the man in the mugshot and the man responsible for the Zodiac crimes could indeed be one and the same. However, critics pointed out that sketches based on memory, especially years after the fact, are prone to inaccuracies and should not be treated as definitive evidence. Buoyed by all the professional analyses, Stewart went beyond that, and he carefully examined the physical characteristics of Van Best as recorded in existing records and photographs. Eyewitnesses to the Zodiac Slayer had given varied yet overlapping descriptions, usually a man of medium build who wore glasses and had a calm, methodical demeanor. Van Best seemed to Stewart the best fit for that general profile. He pointed out the unusual match of glasses style, the particular spacing of the eyes, and even the curve of the jawline. He also mentioned Van Best's lifelong history of wearing clothing associated with the Zodiac's known appearance, military-style jackets among them. All of this added Stewart's mind-circumspect constructions into a growing pattern, affirming his conviction about Van Best. However, while these supplements have been added to limit forensic face comparisons in criminal investigations, forensic face analysis relies mostly on a lot of subjectivity while making composites through witness memory. These composite images are affected by several external factors, such as lighting conditions during the creation, artistic interpretation, and memory distortion. While Stewart was persuaded by what he perceived as compelling visual evidence, some others warned against putting too much credence in appearance alone. Some rumors went that certain experts completely rejected the match, while others were not willing to express an opinion on it. This photo, however, became one of the cornerstones of Stewart's theory, kind of symbolic proof, in his mind, that maybe the father he never knew had been hiding in plain sight, after all. Forensics and handwriting analysis. As Gary Stewart deepened his investigation into Earl Van Best Jr., he turned his attention to what had long fascinated both law enforcement and amateur sleuths alike: the mysterious handwritten letters of the Zodiac Slayer. These taunting notes, sent to newspapers and police, contained cryptic messages and elaborate threats. For Stewart, the possibility that Van Best could have authored them was more than just a theory. It became a major focus of his case. He began searching for samples of his father's handwriting, digging through official documents such as marriage records, arrest forms, and legal filings. These sources provided authentic, dated examples of Van Best's writing style, giving Stewart material to compare with the notorious Zodiac letters. Determined to strengthen his case with forensic input, Stewart enlisted the help of handwriting analysts to conduct professional comparisons. These experts were asked to evaluate the similarities between Van Best's handwriting and the script found in the Zodiac's letters, particularly those filled with taunts and threats from the late 1960s and early 70s. One sample Stewart submitted for review was Van Best's signature on his marriage certificate to Judith Chandler. According to Stewart, analysts found a number of points of similarity, such as distinctive slants, letter loops, and the way certain capital letters were formed, that they believed could point to a common author. These findings, though not conclusive, were enough to add fuel to Stewart's claims. The most hotly contested comparisons were the capital D, R, and G, as well as peculiar spacing and rhythmic properties of certain lines of text, with Stewart noting that the overall tone and cadence of the Zodiac letters, arrogant, calculated, and mocking, seemed to fit with what he had learned about Van Best's personality and past behaviors. Stewart stated that minor consistencies, however small, in form and voice, created a case that could not be easily dismissed. Rumor has it, forensic document examiners leaning toward the possibility of a match, though no law enforcement agency ever publicly endorsed the finding. Thus, handwriting would be the strongest link for Stewart between his father and the Zodiac. However, not everyone found the handwriting evidence convincing. Experts in forensic document examination have long debated the reliability of handwriting analysis, especially when used to draw criminal conclusions. Critics of Stewart's theory noted that similarities in handwriting can occur between unrelated individuals, and that cognitive bias can play a significant role in subjective evaluations. Additionally, Zodiac researchers pointed out inconsistencies between Van Best's writing and some of the letters attributed to the Slayer. Despite these critiques, Stewart remained steadfast in his belief that the handwriting was more than a coincidence. It became, in his view, another piece of a complex puzzle, one that led him to a chilling conclusion about the father he never truly knew. The cryptic clues. One of the most intriguing elements of Gary Stewart's theory, linking his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., to the Zodiac Slayer, lies in the cryptic codes and ciphers the Slayer famously mailed to the press and police. Stewart claimed that during his deep dive into the Zodiac's complex cryptograms, he identified a repeating pattern, one that appeared to include the initials EVB, matching his father's name. In particular, Stewart pointed to the infamous 340-character cipher, a puzzle that baffled experts for decades. According to Stewart, portions of the cipher, when rearranged or viewed from certain angles, seemed to reveal those three letters. While some viewed this as a stretch or coincidence, others found it a compelling detail that added a personal twist to the mystery. In addition to these letter patterns, Stewart focused on the Zodiac's writing style and word choices, which he believed aligned closely with Van Best's personality and intellectual background. Van Best, according to records and family accounts, had a deep interest in literature, religion, and linguistics. He was described as intelligent and well-read, particularly fascinated by rare books and philosophical ideas. Stewart suggested that this background made his father uniquely equipped to construct the Zodiac's ciphers, texts that included references to astrology, classical literature, and coded language. These linguistic flourishes, Stewart believed, weren't just tools of communication. They were part of a psychological game being played by a man who saw himself as intellectually superior. Stewart also presented a type of joint fascination between Van Best and the Zodiac Slayer, an appreciation for secret codes and arcane symbols. According to rumors from those who had known Van Best, he was absorbed in his interest in ciphers and puzzles. Stewart believed that the disturbances might have created a motive for the Zodiac's cryptographic games. For Stewart, the letters were not mere threats. They were riddles, written substance with occult meanings that seemed purposely designed to mock the authorities and public alike. Stewart said that only one with Van Best's unique interests and psychology could take credit for this deeply layered, manipulative, and purposefully confusing work. It was this close similarity that became a mainstay in Stewart's argument. They vehemently claimed that this was not a mere case of circumstantial coincidence, but rather one mind full force through two public personas. The journalistic web. One of the more unexpected threads in Gary Stewart's theory, linking his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., to the Zodiac Slayer, involves the well-known journalist Paul Avery. Avery was a key figure in the Zodiac investigation, having reported extensively on the case for the San Francisco Chronicle. But years earlier, Avery also covered a very different story: Van Best's scandalous relationship with Judith Chandler, which came to be known in the press as the ice cream romance. Stewart noted that Avery had written about the unlawful marriage and Van Best's subsequent arrest, effectively casting him into the public eye as a criminal. This overlap led Stewart to believe that Avery had unknowingly found himself at the center of two deeply interconnected stories. Stewart speculated that Van Best may have developed a grudge against Avery and the media at large. According to this theory, the intense and often mocking coverage of his relationship with Chandler left Van Best humiliated and exposed. Stewart suggested that Van Best's later actions as the Zodiac Slayer could have been, in part, a twisted attempt to retaliate, not only against Avery, but against the institutions that had ridiculed and condemned him. In this light, the Zodiac's cryptic letters and games weren't just random terror tactics. They were calculated efforts to toy with the media, undermine police credibility, and reclaim control of his public image through fear. Some of the communications from the Zodiac were delivered directly to newspaper offices, most prominently the San Francisco Chronicle, where Paul Avery worked. One letter even included a personal threat directed toward Avery himself, which spurred him into carrying a gun. This targeting, according to Stewart, was no accident and was very personal. He thought Van Best bitter enough about the previous scandal treatment to see this assault as a kind of radical symbolic revenge. Thus, all the newspapers, police agencies, and reporters became prime candidates for the Zodiac's wrath, further feeding the idea that this slayer did not harbor a vendetta only against society, but also against those very institutions that had once scrutinized him. Just as Stewart's theory began to gain momentum in the public eye, a wave of unexpected challenges threatened to tear it all apart. Backlash and a shaky foundation. Despite the attention Gary Stewart's book The Most Dangerous Animal of All received upon publication, the story soon came under intense scrutiny. Independent researchers, journalists, and documentary producers began examining Stewart's claims in greater detail, and many of them reported finding significant discrepancies. In particular, the FX documentary adaptation of his book presented a more critical lens, with producers uncovering what they described as inconsistencies and contradictions in the timeline, the evidence, and some of the biographical details Stewart had presented. Some sources noted that key pieces of the puzzle, such as travel records and alleged cipher interpretations, didn't hold up under closer inspection. Among the most damaging revelations were rumors that Stewart may have fabricated or exaggerated portions of his book to fit his theory. Critics argued that some of the documentary's findings suggested certain official documents used in the book were not actually sourced from law enforcement or authenticated archives, but may have been altered or even created by Stewart himself. While these rumors sparked fierce debate among true crime enthusiasts, they had a clear effect. They undermined the public's trust in the book's narrative. As a result, what had once been hailed as a potential breakthrough in the Zodiac case began to lose credibility among investigators, scholars, and even casual followers of the case. The fallout had an undeniably personal effect on Stewart. Post-release interviews discussed his disappointment and emotional exhaustion with the reception of his work. He felt, reportedly, that he had been betrayed and frustrated, most notably by the suggestion that he had somehow twisted the truth. His past was scrutinized not for healing, but to question his honesty and sanity. Friends noted changes in his health, though they couldn't directly link them to his claims. Instead, they saw a man worn down by public doubt and the burden of defending a controversial story. Confronting his father and connecting him to a notorious slayer, only to face mass skepticism, left Stewart deeply shaken. If this story left you questioning everything, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's darkest mysteries. Got thoughts on who the Zodiac really was? Drop them below. We want to hear from you. And don't stop now. Click the next video on your screen for another chilling case that might just connect the dots.